It seems Charles Jamrach had a penchant for snakes also, and there are a number of references to dangerous serpents being kept in the shop. In the Harper's New Monthly Magazine of 1878, some insight into Jamrach's familiarity with the snakes is revealed. We also see how few safeguards were in place to protect himself and his visitors. Quoted directly from the author, Jamrach then opens a trunk and takes out of it with his hand a snake about 3 feet long, ash-coloured save for yellowish tints, and holds it out towards me with the innocent question whether it is not a fine fellow. The reptile has a strong body and holds itself straight out from Jamrach's hand like a stick, then squirms from side to side, too insinuatingly for my taste, but its owner declares it never bites. If it were to bite, it would be all up with you, he serenely adds. I was rather glad that it didn't bite, although I turned around and found a dozen cobra heads erected against the glass within 6 inches of my head, and observing that the covering to their box was only white paper, I began to think that it was time to see the tigers. Nor was the situation in the little room, some 10 feet wide, made more cheerful by the fact that just then a boy was bitten by a boa constrictor brought in that morning. It made 8 or 10 little perforations in his finger. The boy was still at his work, and on my suggestion that the attention of a surgeon might seem desirable, a pale-faced clerk raised his head and said, "Oh dear no, we never go to the physicians for a little thing like that. The only danger is that the animal sometimes leaves a tooth in the wound." And he went on writing. Jamrach said, "These new boas are nasty-tempered. They came in this morning. I'll show them to you." I would have been willing to forego the sight, but he'd already shoved open a round dumpy basket, a foot deep by more than a foot in diameter, and he was unbinding the rope tied around it. He took off the cover, and there, piled in one mass, were 9 young boa constrictors, that on the top being the one that had bitten the boy. They remained quiet, and we didn't interrupt their slumbers, and the lid was closed on them safely. It is difficult to imagine how there should be a demand for snakes, but Jamrach supplies the zoological gardens of Europe. There ought to be some experiments of a moral and aesthetic nature on these boas. One of these reptiles which Jamrach recently got had quite a curious history. An English ship which had stopped at the wharf at the African Cape had a sort of dance on board, and in the evening before sailing for England a band had played music during the night. It is supposed that the boa was attracted by this music. At any rate, it was discovered after the ship was a week in its voyage. The first intimation of its presence was the disappearance of the rats with which the ship had long been infested. The crew and passengers were at first alarmed, but they managed to make the animal a secure prisoner in that part of the ship in which he'd secreted himself. And when the vessel arrived in London, Jamrach was sent for and took with him this amusing sea serpent. In a different article, this time on snake charming in Pearson's magazine, in July 1898, Mark Lane interviews a Captain de Vere who makes the following points about his chosen hobby. He says that the snake charmer who wants to make a purchase for the purposes of his performance goes to Jamrachs or some other well-known emporium. He says the price of snakes varies from 30 shillings to 20 or 30 pounds. The snakes arrive in a completely wild and untamed state. He also says that many people have the impression that snakes, before being used by a snake charmer in performance, are drugged or by some other means rendered harmless. This, however, is quite a mistake. It must surely have been the money that made Jamrach enter this snake business, for he seemed to have very little luck with them. It's not possible to know the degree of truth. In a story written by Stanley Kendall, he wrote a story called On the Trail of a Serpent, a book of stories contained within the Literary Compendium. The story surrounds a Mr. Thomas John, who is a buyer for the famous menagerie and animal supplier Jamrachs. Mr. John is returning from Africa, where he's found a massive python which he's returning to Jamrachs in a packing case. On return to London, he realises with horror that his packing case contains the massive python but has been swapped with that of a fine-looking young lady. Adventures of the snake are followed through sightings of apparently hallucinating drunks. Finally, the snake is chased to Victoria Park, where it's recaptured after living on cats and ducks. Mr. John manages to discover and recover the snake without it being discovered that it was ever he who even lost it. Presumably Mr. John and Mr. Charles Jamrach breathed a very heavy sigh of relief and got on to live another day. Now, whilst it was the grander species that gained Jamrach his notoriety, his legacy must surely be that he was a great naturalist and recognised for his expertise in a variety of areas. Jamrach even had a seashell named after him, which was Ameria jamrachii. First described in Western Australia and in Indonesia, the shell itself is a handsome, if somewhat small one, with parallel stripes running along its length, which is between 3 and 5 inches. He was also famous as an importer and exporter of fish. Frank Buckland, in his article written in 1880, Natural History of British Fishes, wrote about the humble goldfish. They are transported in an oval cask with a perforated bung on the side. The cask is not filled and the splashing of water aerates it. They are sent long distances, such as to Denmark, Russia, Italy, England, etc. My friend Mr. Jamrach, the well-known animal dealer of 180 St. George's Street, often has large consignments of these fish, which though small are very handsome and good coloured. But it was perhaps in the importation of fancy birds that Jamrach became best known, and in this area he had significant firsts. For example, he was the first to import the western tragopan, the distribution of this bird throughout the western Himalayas between 8 and 10,000 feet, from extreme northern Pakistan to northwest India and southwest Tibet, also gives us something of a range to the business network of Jamrach. As well as being a very handsome bird, the British who visited the Himalayas regarded this pheasant as a game bird. Consequently, it's likely that sportsmen or biological collecting houses that were popular in Britain during the 19th century first introduced the western tragopan to fly tyers who appreciated the variegated feathers for fishing flies. As well as the Himalayas, Jamrach was also active in India and is known to have acquired the only example of the blue-legged lorry from a market in Calcutta, from whence it was sent to London Zoo. Remarkably, Jamrach is also credited with giving cockatiels their name. He's said to have adapted the word from the Dutch kakatiel. Though not the first to introduce budgerigars to England, Dr. Russ certainly asserts that the first pair of budgerigars sold in England was bought by Charles Jamrach in London for £26, and he subsequently sold them to Dr. Butler of Woolwich for £27. Not all birds were to flourish as well as the common budgie. One of the sadder aspects of Jamrach's trade in animals was his trade in endangered species such as the Spix macaw, which was a rare and prized bird even in Jamrach's day. At the time it was thought that the number of birds in captivity exceeded those in the wild, and yet despite their rarity, Jamrach managed to acquire one from Mr. Rothschild, who subsequently donated it to London Zoo. Through the greed of a few collectors, the Spix macaw almost went the same way as the dodo, though thankfully it did not, and now through breed and release programs, the Spix is happily making its return. It seems that a visitor to Jamrachs needed a good dose of courage, and though the dangers were perhaps exaggerated, they were very real. One writer notes that few persons returned from that place in an unmutilated condition. He illustrates his remarks by reference to the fate of some of his own personal friends, one of whom has the flesh from his back torn into strips by a bear, whilst another had been fearfully bitten and clawed by a leopard. A third had had the whole of his clothes torn off by a monkey and had to be taken home in a four-wheeler cab wrapped up in a policeman's greatcoat. The correspondent also says that the animals were none of your civilised beasts with polished manners such as might be found in zoological gardens, but instead they were fresh from the jungles and with nothing between the beast and the visitor but the thin walls of a large tea chest. The author also describes a visiting Philadelphian who was said to have escaped from a bird 5 feet tall with a bowie knife for a beak which aimed to stab him in the back. From there he rushed into the dangerous proximity of a jackal and then into the dangerous proximity of a tiger. Having met Jamrach for the first time, one author described him as a genius naturalist and importer, who was, to quote, a huge German with blonde hair, rosy cheeks, and a substantial, vigorous look about him, which was in accords with his manner and intelligence.